Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Morning, everyone. Hope you're having a fabulous week. Today on the podcast, Mikkipedia, we are talking ketogenic diets, continuous glucose monitoring, and a whole bunch of other geeky science stuff with my mates, Dr Cliff Harvey. He's now probably a show regular and his episodes get a heap of traction, so I know that you guys really dig what he has to say. But Cliff and I are joined by Dr Dan Plews. Now, Dan will be no stranger to anyone who is interested in distance triathlon, in any sort of endurance sport, or actually anyone who is interested in sailing, because he was the performance specialist over for Team New Zealand who took out America's Cup earlier this year. And this is such a cool conversation. So let me introduce Dan for those of you who don't know him. He is an exercise physiologist who has had his PhD for a number of years now, and he has over 35 peer-reviewed publications. Not only that, he's worked closely with athletes who have won more than 25 world and Olympic titles. Dan's a coach. He's coached 3 pro Ironman athletes to sub 8 hours, including Lorenzo Bozzoni, Jan van Berkel and Tim van Berkel. And he's a coach to age groupers who are consistently hitting PBs in Ironman and 70.3 events. And Dan is, unsurprisingly, also an athlete himself and an incredible athlete. He is the 2018 Ironman Age Group World Championship course winner, record holder in 8 hours, 24 minutes, 36 seconds, which is an astoundingly fast time at Kona. And he is also the 2018 Ironman Age Group Taupo course record holder in 8:35, which again is just so unbelievable considering he then went in the same year over 10 minutes faster at Kona, which is phenomenal. Dan has also built a huge community behind him with Enduro IQ. He's the founder of Enduro IQ, which brings education to athletes and coaches and anyone interested in long distance triathlon. Enduro IQ is a company that was built in the hope of sharing with athletes and coaches how to land in the middle of enjoyment, health, and performance. And you really get some amazing information from this course. And subsequent to the course, Dan has also set up the Enduro IQ Training Squad, which gives athletes access to a training hub with proven training plans and workouts adjustable to their own training and performance goals. So that is Dan. He's got so many strings to his bow, and we just touch on a snippet of what he's interested in today's show. And it really is just a conversation with 3 geeks. I must say that I am the least smart of all 3 of us. And just to remind you about Cliff Harvey, he is a nutritionist, author, life and purpose coach, and researcher that is based here in Auckland, New Zealand. In over 2 decades of practice, Dr. Cliff Harvey has helped thousands of people to achieve their goals, from those who are chronically and acutely unwell through to elite level athletes and elite attitude business people and entrepreneurs. Cliff is the brains and founder behind Holistic Performance Institute, which provides people with certificates and education in and around sports nutrition and health coaching. And I have a course with Cliff over on Holistic Performance Institute, all related to female nutrition. You can catch Cliff at cliffharvey.com, and you can contact Dan via endureiq.com. That is ENDUREIQ.com. So I hope that you enjoy this pretty geeky conversation that I had with Cliff and Dan. And we're on. Kia ora, Cliff, Dan. I feel like I'm kind of like in the room with 2 of the gurus in New Zealand, all about keto and exercise and just, well, gurus and geeks actually. Anyway, how are you?
I was going to say the same thing.
Should we
And I
just
was
turn
going to
this
say the
into?
same thing.
We should just turn this into some kind of mutual appreciation session, should we?
For sure.
It's pretty much that
Now,
already.
it is, right? So what I just want to do is we thought we'd get together and just have a bit of a yarn about, Dan, your continuous glucose monitoring experiment, because, you know, I'm really interested for you to elucidate more on some of those details that you've been sharing on your Instagram posts. And so Cliff and I were going to catch up, but Cliff is such a brainiac in and around the keto and in and around pretty much anything diet related that I just knew that he'd be super interested to come on in and give some thoughts potentially around some things as well. And I'll just probably just sit here and listen. Yeah, right, like as if I don't talk. But one of the first things I want to ask you, Dan, because we were just talking about the black currant supplement, because I had mentioned that I've had a chat to Fleur Cushman, and she's basically one of the brains behind Currans as a supplement, and she's based in London. And there's a lot of really good research out there to show its potential benefits. And I mentioned that I was using it, but haven't actually noticed too much difference to date. But you in the lab have noticed some changes in some people.
Yeah, well, we noticed, like, in not many people, we're just kind of trialing it within a few of the students when we got sent a few of the black currants, and yeah, we noticed that at least in people who had poor fat oxidation, it really bumped up the fat oxidation when testing the lab using the metabolic cart. So yeah, well, we thought that was pretty interesting. But like I said to you just before, you know, with all these kind of ergogenic aids, so to speak, or supplements, you just generally see more of a boost when it comes to when people who are either older or not as highly tuned or not as athletic. You know, even with like beetroot juice, you know, you'll see very similar things. I know that there's been some great research done in like economy of walking in elderly people when they use beetroot juice, but look, as you kind of go up the chain and they get and athletes get better and better and the physiology is a little bit better, it's harder to make a difference.
So the types of changes and stuff that you might expect to see, or that you saw, are they meaningful changes? You know, like, because there is one thing for it to be, you know, statistically significant, but another thing to actually, you know, make a real difference.
Yeah, I mean, statistically, no, because we didn't do it in a big cohort of people, right? But
yeah.
You know, the thing is, it's that's a problem with sports science and interventions in general, like especially when it comes to nutrition. The individual variation is just so massive that you can typically end up with a null finding, even though often in one person it can be massive improvement and a massive difference, but in another person there's a negative improvement, then in a few people there's not. So, you know, the individual variation is something to be accounted for. But in this particular person, you know, what you can do in that particular instance is you can say, okay, what's the day-to-day variation in fat oxidation? What's the day-to-day variation or the technical error measure on the machinery that we're using it in? And when you're looking at individuals, that's when you can actually look at you can count that as meaningful change, because if it's outside the general noise of measure on a day-to-day basis, you can assume that it could be something for sure. And I know this change in fat oxidation was certainly not a normal day-to-day change that we would see. I mean, I liken it to submaximal heart rate. So submaximal heart rate, if you and me, we cycle on a ergometer at 200 watts and we do it for a week, we're probably typically going to see around a 6 to 7 beat day-to-day variation. So, you know, if we're seeing suddenly we have an intervention and it's a 15 beat difference, then you can be pretty sure that intervention is likely doing something on an individual level at least.
So interesting, eh? And we mentioned beetroot as well. Cliff, weren't you involved in some beetroot trials?
Not really, only
No?
by virtue of being good mates with Joe McQuillan.
Oh, there you
so
go.
I was sort of
yeah.
around while he was doing his stuff, and we obviously started using it with a lot of our athletes as, you know, Joey was doing his research, and so we supply beets to a lot of professional sports teams and a lot of professional athletes, but, you know, that's really the extent of my interaction with beets is just to pass them on to people.
Didn't Joe find that, because he did it in pretty high level cyclists, right? And I think one of his findings was that it potentially was even detrimental to the more elite cyclists, because they've already got good vasodilation, and the beetroot juice only exemplifies that, and then there's potential of a loss of systemic circulation because you're almost having a bit of leaky valve, so for want of a better word. So that's what I think he found. That's one of his findings from memory. Is that right?
I believe so. And I think that they weren't really sure whether that was just a sort of muddy finding or whether there was, a potential negative.
Yeah,
I think
right,
that was
okay.
a function of... I think it's probably a function of what you're saying as well, and that, you're looking at elite athletes with very small cohorts, and so you're going to be seeing pretty skinny effects anyway. And, there can be detriment, or decrement, I should say, seen in any study. Whether it results from the supplement or not, you couldn't be 100% sure. It's an interesting tangent to explore, though, because I think most of the people who are using beets are pretty high-level athletes. And so, maybe there is a greater application for Gen Pop, and not just for performance, but for health, for maybe cognition, maybe for blood pressure modulation. And so there might be a lesser application for those elite-level athletes. However, there might be a profound placebo effect for some of them as well.
Well, yeah, we love a good placebo effect for sure.
Hey, mate,
it's quite hard to
effect.
blunt the taste of that. Yeah, of course you would. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Do you know, I was always, back in my real zealous days, I mean, I'm still a zealot, but I'm just slightly less so now. I was always looking at those beet it shots and going, well, there's about 16 grams of sugar in that. So if you give that to an athlete, is that going to impact negatively on fat oxidation? Is it going to change their ability to switch between fuel substrates, or like really tap into fat? But was I just a bit zealous thinking about like that with those beet shots?
It's a good question, because I think, I would say that there would be an effect if you're taking it immediately before exercise. I mean, if you have enough time to wash out and, get back to baseline, whether 16 odd grams is enough to really impact that, I think, Dan would be the one to answer that question. What have you seen in your research, Dan, in terms of taking carbohydrate immediately before?
Yeah, so I mean that is actually, it's quite a small amount, really. I'm not sure you would see too much in that. Like we like my PhD student Jeff Rothschild, he's actually doing this as his very topic. He just finished. We're just actually looking to publish a paper where he looked at fat oxidation rates fasted, fat oxidation rates with carbohydrate, and that I can't remember the exact amount. So I think it was a reasonable amount. You're talking like 60, 70 grams. But it was like white bread and jam, so you couldn't get much
Delicious.
much more sugary than that. And then it was protein and fat, and you definitely saw a reduction in fat oxidation when you took the sugary carbs before. But again, it's a little bit more. But you would expect. I mean, if it's a simple sugar, you're going to have an insulin spike. That's going to affect your fat oxidation, so you would expect a little bit of difference. Yeah. So what we saw was that fat oxidation was the highest fasted, protein and fat, which was it was basically a whey protein, and we just added some peanut butter so it was equaling number of calories as a protein and fat, and then this jam and kind of white bread. Yeah. So but the protein and fat was very close in fat metabolism to fasted.
Was it just looking at fat oxidation? Was it looking at any performance indicators or anything, Dan?
Yes, yeah. So we did that as well. So the actual test itself was you did 4 5-minute stages, and that was just to look at the submaximal values where we looked at the fat oxidation. You then had a little bit of a rest, and then you did 6 by 3 minutes. The first 3 were at your threshold, anaerobic threshold power, and then the next 3 were maximal as much work as you could do over those intervals, and there was no difference in performance. So no matter what. And what was really interesting is that as soon as at the lower levels, when you didn't really need to, you upped your fat oxidation in a fasted state. But even in the fasted state, when you were required to tap into carbohydrate oxidation, it would be equal to the carbohydrate fed group. So there's always carbohydrates that even in a fasted state, you can just tap into some, those endogenous stores, and then you're producing that exact same work. So, which for me, I mean, we're just writing this paper up at the moment, and we were going through it, and I said to Jeff, I'm like, one of the main things that you need to include in this is that from an athlete perspective with REDS, and all that kind of thing, it's really beneficial because athletes that can be quite obsessed with increasing their fat oxidation, so they do a lot of fasted training, they don't eat before, they then are in negative energy balance the rest of the day, they can't often catch that up. But at least this is something to say, hey, you can have fat and protein just before you exercise, and it's not really going to have any implications on your fat oxidation, so don't worry about that so much. Have some food, do your exercise, and you'll be pretty sweet.
Yeah, and it was Jeff's paper that did a review of that area that really kind of solidified for me that of those points that you were just talking about. So as his paper that he'd published late last year that looked at what is the impact of protein before exercise, or what is the impact of carbs before exercise, and it appeared that was the case, that potentially fat oxidation was not going to be impaired with protein. So that changed my recommendations to the athletes that I work with in my online coaching system as well. And I feel like as coaches in that nutrition space, but also obviously with athletes, nutrition or otherwise, there's been so much more of a focus now on reds and on that energy availability. And it's quite good to be able to come at it from that point of, well, yes, fat oxidation is important, but you've got choices outside of just your white bread and jam that can help.
Yeah. But listen to this though. What was really interesting about this study, because I was a subject in the study as well, so I got to indulge in a bit of white bread and jam which is a once in a while. But what I found interesting, one of the take homes from a personal perspective, was obviously I'm pretty fat adapted, and like you ate the white bread and you had the jam, it massively had implications on your fat oxidation. But my fat oxidation was still higher than any other subjects, and there was 16 or 17 subjects. It was still higher than anyone's, even when I had white bread and jam, because it was still so robust to those macronutrients. Yeah, so I thought that was quite a cool little, N of one, but I thought that was quite exciting. So
yeah, how long have you been keto for? Well, how long have you been dabbling in low carb and had been in keto, and so where are you at now with all of that stuff, Dan?
Yeah, so since 2012, and I'm still pretty low carb. Yeah. I think you said before you feel like way back you then where you were a bit of a zealot, and I'm definitely way more open now to different methods and ways, but I still firmly believe that a lower carbohydrate diet for specifically long distance triathlon, at least, which is what I'm mostly interested in, is absolute paramount, particularly if you're newer to the sport. So another, I'm just talking too much now, but another thing that we're looking at AUT University, we're looking at some data at the moment, is what is influencing fat oxidation the most. So obviously, like VO2 max, we know has strong correlation with fat oxidation rates, because there's more generally VO2 max, more type 1 fibers, more mitochondria in the muscle cell, more ability to have beta oxidation and fat metabolism. But what we're finding is better than that is actually training age. So the longer you have been doing training for, and specifically endurance training, generally the better your fat oxidation. So which is why I think we see a lot of the pros and elites who typically don't have to worry too much about what they're eating. But I think if you're newer to the sport and you've not done particularly Ironman or ultra sports for a long time, not having some idea of or intervention to improve your fat oxidation is not going to be that advantageous for you when in a sport which requires you to have a decent fat oxidation. So that's another little interesting thing we've found for pull from some of the data.
Yeah, sure. And now, Dan, like in the textbooks, I believe that the kind of maximum fat oxidation went up to say 1 gram a minute or something. And then that was blown out of the water when the FASTER study was published to show that rates of fat oxidation like well exceeded that. What's your fat oxidation rate?
1.4 is my max. Yeah, 1.4 grams per minute. Yeah, but that's not in ketosis either. So you can always, like, if I got deliberately into ketosis, for example, you'd expect that to be a little bit high because it does upregulate your fat oxidation. But that's just first thing in the morning having a normal kind of food the night before. So I think the FASTER study, it showed 1.7, 1.8 grams per minute.
Oh, interesting.
I think that was up at that kind of level.
Yeah.
So, I think Zach Bitter, who was in that study, who's a colleague of mine at SFuels, I think he was like 1.6, 1.7.
There you go.
holds the 100-mile world record. So yeah, not too shabby.
No, not too shabby. And he's just training now to run from California to San Fran, actually.
Yeah. Madness.
Crazy. I know. What about you, Cliff?
Are you doing any marathon running across California anytime soon?
I was thinking about fat oxidation as you're sitting there drinking your beer, actually. Like, I wonder if Cliff is in ketosis right now.
Yeah, nothing wrong with the beer. I have a good low carb blonde many an evening.
I get in my 7,500 steps a day. That's basically the extent of my endurance. But no, I think this is, all of these studies that come out showing, the influence of what we can do dietary wise on fat oxidation and then the functional outcomes, I think, are really important because in this study that you are involved with, Dan, the increase in fat oxidation is obviously an important aspect. The mitigation of any downregulation of that by having protein and fat as compared to carbohydrate is another important sort of tangent. And it sort of plays into this whole idea that we really need to be looking at outcomes-focused nutrition, right? Because if you're in a relatively short event or you're in a relatively short training session, we can draw quite a lot of conclusions from this. Number one is something that's consistent with the existing research is that you don't need to have carbs before training or events necessarily. You may need to have carbohydrate before or during events if they're incredibly long. But also, as you mentioned, the questions around energy deficiency are pretty big nowadays. And I see it a lot in even general population clients. See a huge amount nowadays who are consistently undereating, and that's probably the primary thing we need to work on for gut health, for IBS, for anxiety, depression, all these various things. And so there's different outcomes that can come out of looking at studies or the body of work because of that. So for example, if you are consistently underfueled, it might be a really good idea to have some protein and fat before training. Maybe even some after training. Maybe some protein and carbs after training. Maybe consider if you're consistently undereating, adding some carbs back in. On the other hand, if you're consistently overfueling, there's a really good argument there to not have to load up before training, to use other strategies like fasting or low carb, keto, whatever it happens to be, to reduce that auto-regulated energy intake. So I think that's one of the most exciting, somewhat complex, but one of the most exciting aspects to come out of all of this research, which is now sort of accumulating, is that we can get great results from very different dietary strategies.
Yeah, I listened to you a few times now, Cliff, and that targeted nutrition approach is something that I think it's just such a strong case that people just seem to just not think about. And it's like, well, obviously, if you're training to build a load of muscle, and you don't necessarily need to be restricting your carbohydrates. So it's just like, yeah, exactly. Big muscles like you don't, you need a bit. In fact, you need a bit of insulin. You need, because that promotes growth. But if that's not your concern, it's like, what are you trying to achieve? So yeah, it's some exciting things. But just on the fasting thing. So last week I did this thing with Sip Kitchen just on Apollo Drive here in Auckland, where we're testing. It's like they call it My 800, which is 800 calories a day for 3 days. And it's amazing what you can actually do with low calories, because I was doing 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day on 800 calories of fuel, and I was feeling pretty good on it, really. Yeah, it was good.
Do you reckon, Dan, is there anything to do with some uptick in your stress response and catecholamines from the rapid drop in calories?
Could be.
Because often people say, going into ketosis and stuff, or dropping your calories, going low carb.
So it was I actually quite enjoyed the process. It was really a lot of, I learned a lot from it, because I've done a similar thing before with the fasting mimicking diet, the Dr. Voltalongo one. And obviously that's like zero protein. So with this one, it's 3 meals a day, 16 grams of protein per meal. And I found it like so much easier. Same amount of calories, 800 calories, so much easier. I could train so much more easily on it as well. And what was remarkable was my HRV went so high, my resting heart rate was super low. And I wonder if it's partly metabolic rate, because I think my metabolic rate was like, hang on a minute, you're a bit low on the old calories here. You're going to have to drop your metabolic rate a little bit. I mean, I wear an Apple Watch, and if I was sat around for too long, I go, warning, your heart rate has been below 40 for the past 10 minutes. Yeah, so...
Are you alive?
Are you alive? Yeah. But I found it really good. I definitely do it again. I mean, I have a few questions around it, like with the fasting mimicking and any fasting, is it giving the same benefits in cellular cleansing or autophagy and all that kind of stuff? But I think, it's an interesting one, because on one side the fasting mimicking is really designed to be quite catabolic. So you're adding the protein, it's not going to be as catabolic. But then at the same time, I'm doing exercise, so that's reduced. That's being a bit more catabolic. And also another thing is that fasting boosts your NAD, and with the fasting mimicking diet, there's other things that you can't do that would boost your NAD. So you can't do decent exercise. It's even difficult to get in like in a sauna or something. So maybe this approach where you can do things on top of it might overall be more beneficial. So but I'm definitely going to do it again, because I just, as a general reset, and also a psychological, I like it from the psychology point of view, where I'm like, okay, I'm just not going to eat as much.
You like to suffer.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit of that.
Yeah. No.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'd love to hear what your thoughts, both of your thoughts are on that, because you're the more nutrition gurus than me. I was just giving it a whirl.
Well, I listened to a podcast last year, and it was Dom D'Agostino was chatting to Bob off Peter Attia's podcast, and he didn't ask me anything all about keto, and Dom talked through a keto longevity approach that was very similar to Voltalongo, but like the one that you've just described. It's sort of based on restricting calories by 50% of your usual, doing it for 5 days, eating it with a time-restricted window, upping the protein slightly, but the protein sources being kind of salmon, basically, and white fish. So not red meat, not chicken or anything like that, no dairy involved either. And the premise of it was, if you can get that glucose to ketone ratio of between 1 and 2, then that's going to elicit a lot of the benefits that Voltalongo is purporting to get in the with his longevity diet, but just as you said, Dan, with a lot less catabolism. And so Dom kind of described this out, and I thought, God, that sounds really interesting. So then I went home and I designed the keto longevity diet, which I sell on my website, FYI, not the food, but the diet plan itself.
Yeah.
But basically just based on that, because I thought, yeah, exactly. I thought, well, there's a product just waiting to be developed.
Yeah.
And Sip Kitchen has obviously brought that to life. But
yeah. So is that an 800 calorie? Was that 800 calories per day? Was it just half your normal? Half your normal?
Yeah, half your normal. And so just what I did, I'm like, well, most people are probably going to, there's just different levels, and you can't really cater to everyone. But I'm like, right, well, I'll do level 1 at 750 calories. I'll do level 2 at 1,000 and level 3 at 1,250. Just okay. So all low, obviously, and well below probably what both of you would actually eat in a day. But like you, I'm not 100% sold on the idea that from a longevity perspective, you need to have an incredibly low protein intake. And this is not because I'm a brainiac, it's because the other brainiacs that I listen to are also not sold on it, like Stu Phillips and Don Layman. And as I understand, they're kind of putting together a rebuttal on that protein piece. Yeah, I think that was my major reason for thinking, actually, Dom's got a really good point. And also he is a brainiac. Anyway, they're my thoughts. Sounds great.
No, it was really good, and yeah, I was actually doing it like you described almost, is that because I always get concerned about not sleeping, so I was not eating until 12 or 1, and then I would have my breakfast, and then I would eat my lunch at 5, and then my dinner at 7. And so kind of back-ended a little bit, just so I could sleep that little much bit better. But I was doing like 2 hours of training a day. So I mean, on my Whoop device, it kind of gives me a very rough estimate of calories per day, and it was around 3,000 calories to 4,000 calories a day. So I was definitely in deficit. I lost 2.5 kilos in 3 days. So
yeah. And Cliff, what about you? What are your thoughts on the whole fasting mimicking?
I guess they're broadly in line with you guys. I think that if people are doing sort of fasting mimicking diets, then the priority, I would say, is to get that protein intake in there to reduce the catabolism, because that's really the outcome of a fasting mimicking diet, right? Is that you want to get the benefits of fasting without the same degree of, say, muscle catabolism. And so it makes a lot of sense. I think the realm of fasting, though, is so convoluted. It's so complex because there are a lot of outcomes we're looking for, and a lot of people are framing it in a diet-only perspective. And obviously, Dan mentioned that there's a lot of other things that encourage, say, autophagy, autophagy, whatever you want to call it, wherever you studied, including certain nutrients, micronutrients, including effective sleep, including particularly exercise and the intensity of exercise. So where we have a lifestyle strategy that is conducive to proper modulation of autophagy, then perhaps some of the benefits of fasting might be somewhat mitigated as well. Similarly to how we were talking about before, certain supplements may not be as effective for the elite athlete. Maybe some of these strategies are actually less effective for those who have broadly what we'd consider a healthy diet and lifestyle strategies. But there's more to it as well, because fasting is not restricted obviously to the physiological benefits. There are benefits for releasing some of our patterns, our behavioral patterns. I think fasting is a really good way to reassess our attachment to food and the way we eat and the particular foods we eat. So there are, psychological and psychosocial benefits. But all of that considered, I would always go back to the research as well and say that with a few exceptions, in particular physiological measures, most of the benefits from fasting do come down to autoregulation of energy over time. And so I think that's a really important consideration, because I'm a big fan of fasting because of its compounded benefits. But I also think that where people elevate fasting to be a dogma, then it can become negative if that person becomes habituated to fasting and maybe they're in an underfueled state. And I see that a lot now. I've seen that with probably 6 clients in the last 2 weeks, is that they fast because of all the purported benefits, but when we look at their energy intake, they're simply not eating enough, and it's difficult for them at their meals to eat more. So the strategy we often use is to add a meal, right? And they freak out often because they think, well, but I'm not fasting anymore. It's like, well, but that doesn't matter, because the main benefits are to help you auto-regulate your energy intake. So if the easiest strategy to help you eat more from a compendium of healthy food, the easiest way to do that is to add a meal. It's not rocket science. We need to look at these diet and lifestyle levers that help us to, over time, have an appropriate energy balance that is also micronutrient replete.
I often think, I love exercise and I love coffee. I can't imagine there's ever a time where I'm not in autophagy. I think I just must go around in some kind of autophagous state most of the time.
I like that adjective.
Thank you. I quite like it too.
We need to remember that, autophagy is not an on-off switch. And, you get that question all the time. I'm sure you guys get it. Like, how long do I need to fast to switch on autophagy? And it's kind of like, well, if you didn't ever have autophagy and apoptosis and mitophagy and those things happening, you'd be dead, right? It's happening. It may not be adequately modulated for optimum health and longevity. So what can we do to shift that balance so we've got the sort of correct balance of catabolic and anabolic processes in the body, which is really what we're talking about. We don't have in the modern psychosocial environment the correct balance often of that anabolic versus catabolic. And that even comes not just from what we're doing. We don't move residually enough. We don't often have a good balance of that with higher intensity activity. We don't have good work-life balance. All those things are true, but there might also be more subtle things like hormetic epigenetic signaling compounds that we get from eating more plant foods, for example. And that could be a really interesting aspect of some of the effects on those catabolic processes on a cellular level. So there's a lot going on in the complex of our diet and lifestyle that I think is underappreciated. And we're often looking at the things that are the switch that turns it on. The other thing that I sort of wanted to bring up is the glucose to ketone ratio, because I'm really not a big fan of glucose to ketone ratios. I think it's a very poor measure for anything, really, because of course, ketones have a raft of effects in the body, many of which are incredibly beneficial. But I think looking at transiently the ratio of ketone to glucose is kind of nothing source. There's not much that we can really derive from it, particularly when it comes to, say, cancer treatment or for improvements in neural health. I just don't think there's much there, because it's really the things we're doing are promoting those outcomes. The consequence of some of the things we're doing might be a shift in those ratios, but we also need to consider that if we have really high ketone levels to achieve certain glucose to ketone ratios, we might also be perhaps overfueling, or we might be, in some cases over fasting. And if that's not ideal for us because our tendency is to undereat, then that's not going to be a good thing. And in terms of cancer treatment, I certainly don't think it's a good idea to have I certainly don't think it's a good idea to have excessively high ketone levels either.
Yeah, that's as I understand it as well. I think Dom was talking about it in the context of that reduced calorie state, as I understand. I mean, maybe I read the entire thing wrong, but that was how he was talking about it. And potentially maybe it's utilised in his research with the Navy SEALs and stuff in that, I don't know, in his research environment. Yeah.
I think it would be more of an outcome than a target, because let's face it, if you do a complete fast, let's say a complete fast for 72 hours, you're probably going to have pretty high ketones anyway. And if you continue that fast, I think it was, I'll have to remember the paper where they had people fasting for sort of 10 days at a time. Ketone levels get pretty freaking high, because obviously glucose is getting really low as well. But for most of us, most of the time, I think we're really looking at ketones as being a top-up fuel, because blood glucose is never really going to fall below what we consider a low normal level. So if we're looking at what we would consider to be total transient fuel availability in the blood at any given time, there is an amount that we require, and for some states and conditions at least, pushing that higher to try and get a particular marker is probably going to be detrimental. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I was just going to say before, that the whole ketone number area, we just know nothing about it. Where these numbers come from as to what's good and what's bad, it's just completely, in my views, it's kind of made up almost. This idea that people said, 0.3, oh, you're in ketosis. Like, well, really? Am I? And this is, we published a paper not long ago, and we had this problem in that, over time, we had it was a very long ketogenic, very low carb study. And what happens is the carbohydrate would stay the exact same every day, it wouldn't change, but ketone levels would come down over time. So, they were less than 50 grams at the start. So if that's your marker of what's good is ketones, then you're going to have to keep dropping and do more and more restricted eating, more and more fasting to try and get those levels up, because eventually, I find it really hard to produce ketones, because I just think I kind of use them so readily, and they're so prevalent in the way I live, is that you just can't look at them as if you're pricking your finger and looking at them as a marker all the time. I just think it's just going to be a slippery slope to excessive fasting, really low carbohydrate availability, and I don't really think it's that necessary, because as you get better and you do it more, you use them better. So
and I don't disagree with any of that, because as I think we've talked in the past about how people chase numbers with ketones, and it's not necessarily appropriate. It's not appropriate, really. It doesn't really tell you how we might use that as a fuel source. And I wonder whether using a ratio, and one of the reasons why it was mentioned was because it is a short-term thing, and maybe from that transient short-term perspective, that's probably where ketones might be a bit more effective. So if you are going into doing something like a fasting mimicking approach, and you've got a 5-day diet, and you're pricking your finger to see the level of ketones, that might be more informative for that short-term period, rather than I'm embarking on this ketogenic lifestyle. I'm gonna, continuously take my ketones.
And you have to be continuously in ketosis, and I think that's with my course, it's designed for more athletes and long Ironman triathletes who are looking at doing like more of a low carb lifestyle. When we try and push them to upregulate the fat station with what's like more of a ketogenic phase, it's only a short phase. Encourage them to use ketones just to take a look at how they're making that transition, because for many of them, they wouldn't have even seen it. They might have had this who are fueling for, who are going around on every ride and doing 60 grams of carbs for every single training session and fueling all the time. And you just don't have that machinery to deal with it. So it's important that you actually see that transition at the start, at least.
For sure. So on that, and on ketones, carbohydrate, and looking at numbers and stuff, Dan, you're still measuring your glucose via the continuous glucose monitoring system, Super Sapiens, is it?
Yeah. So the device is Abbott Libre.
Yeah.
Continuous blood glucose monitor, but the app that analyzes it, that it feeds into, is Super Sapiens. Yeah. And so Super Sapiens, there's a few different apps out there that do this. There's like Levels, and I think there's some other ones, but Super Sapiens is specifically designed for athletes, and for more specifically endurance athletes, I guess, more than anything. So that's I've had that in. Each one lasts about 2 weeks, and this is my second run with it. So I put this in just before I started doing my 800 calories per day for 3 days, just because I was kind of interested to see what would happen with that.
Yeah. Any surprises? So for example, I did ask whether or not you felt amazing because of the stress hormones, but if you could look at your glucose, that might tell you a little bit about the levels of stress and stuff that your body might have been under. Did you notice anything over that?
So during that, what's been quite more amazing is during that period, I was actually, during that period, I did measure my glucose, and I did measure my ketones, and my ketones didn't really go up that much. I don't that really. And my glucose was a lot more stable, so it was always in like between 4 and 5. Whereas when I did the Dr. Volta Longo one, it was like 2.6. I measured it once at 2.6.
Mate.
So it was like super low. I know, if you go to hospital with a blood glucose at that level, you'll be straight on a drip, and they'll be sorting you out.
Yeah.
But so this time I was pretty flat. But what's been more remarkable is that since I've come out of it, and I finished it on Friday. This last week, my blood glucose has been so much less varied and a little bit lower. I mean, I'm never that high, but it has been that little bit lower throughout the day. And that's one of the things that they reckon is really good for this, with this 800 calorie type of diet, is it does make you a little bit more insulin sensitive.
Interesting.
So I have definitely noticed
Dan,
that. Yeah.
That's interesting to me, because I've been thinking a lot recently about this, this idea of benevolent or transient benevolent pseudo-diabetes that we discuss quite a lot now. You guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
So
I do.
So for people listening, the idea is that when we're on a low carb or keto diet for a period of time, or even severely calorie restricted for time, if we then have a large load of carbohydrate, so that would typically be in a glucose tolerance test, or if we just go out and have a big cheat meal or something, we're going to elicit a state of what looks like diabetes, because we've actually down-regulated our insulin sensitivity in order to preserve glucose for the central nervous system. And it's a very well-known thing now. We see it a lot in the research, and we've sort of seen it ourselves, I think, in a lot of our clinical work. But I had a thought that where people are maybe cycling higher carb days, lower carb days, I wonder if people would sort of get used to that. And particularly so if people are very well fat adapted, very keto adapted, sort of long-term fat adapted type stuff. I really wondered if that was going to mitigate some of that effect. So I'm interested to see, when you started eating a bit more again, did you have any higher carb meals where you maybe could have seen some big fluctuations in glucose?
Yeah, so that night I had, for me, it was quite high carb. I had like some kumara potatoes and whatnot. So I actually purposely tried to have a bit of a refeed, and
you
honestly,
devil.
there was.
See, for me, it would have been.
Yeah, exactly. Absolute
fuel.
deviant. But yeah, it was nothing.
No major shift.
Yeah, and if anything, it's gone a little bit lower for the positively. So, but what I've also found that CGM really useful for, particularly for like endurance training, is kind of titrating your kind of that level 2 zone, that endurance zone as well. So, like, you know, if I get it right, if I'm right at the top of my level 2 zone, I can generally see a very gradual decline in my blood glucose. But as soon as I go over it, then glucose will start coming up a little bit. So, you know, it's kind of it's quite good to kind of know where that real level 2 zone is in real time and kind of titrate that a little bit.
So when you say that, Dan, do you mean that you're going along at zone 2 fairly consistently, but then the intensity ramps up so you can actually see that your liver's like going, oh shite, got to get more glucose into the bloodstream? And is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if I'm going on at like 260 watts, for example, on my bike, I'll just be pretty stable with my blood glucose. But then I'll go, like, I'll do a few minutes at like 360 or 370, then it'll just go straight through, you know, straight up. And you can even see it start to creep up. If I even went to 300, you can just see a little bit of an increase as well. But even like if you're doing the same, you can kind of almost measure your durability as well, because if I hold the same power for a long period of time, and it's quite hard towards the end of the workout, often I can see it popping up a little bit because it's getting that little bit harder for me, so I'm having to kind of just work that little bit harder to achieve the same output.
Yeah. So that therefore makes me think, because, you know, you're a guy, you do a lot of measuring of, you know, and you're pretty intuitive really with your zones. Your training age is, you know, pretty high, and I'm not just saying that you're old. So,
yeah.
But it's giving you more...
I've been doing it since I was 9.
Yeah, there you go, mate. Twilight years. So it's actually giving you more insight that's able to contribute to your learning about yourself then. It's like, so you're not looking at that and going, yeah, I kind of knew that would happen. Are you actually going, interesting?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, you can even... we're looking at doing some research in this area, and I was just writing some proposals for a few master's students today, because I'm just really interested in, one is, can we actually use this to prescribe exercise intensity and have a better understanding of where the thresholds are without having to go to the lab, so people can do it at home? And then the other is, can we actually use it to see if we're improving our substrate metabolism? So, for example, if I do an hour at 280 watts and I'm getting a small decrease in my blood glucose, and I do a bit of training, and like 4 weeks later I do it again, but my blood glucose is really stable, then that's a positive adaptation, because I can assume that my fat max has moved, or my maximal fat oxidation has increased. I would assume my fat max has moved, and that's a positive adaptation. And there's other things, like you could even use it for, you can get it real-time fueling as well. Even you could potentially see, if you're doing a race and you can, or some training where you want to actually keep your glucose topped up and you're seeing some kind of dip, you could look, say, maybe I'm going to have a bit of fuel here, or you could use it any way you want. You can use it for, there's so many implications and so many great ways that you could use the data to help. And I mean, and we're not even touching on the health side of things.
So I've got a couple of questions, Dan.
Have you, Cliff, ever used a CGM?
No, I haven't, never. I'd love to get one though, because I think it's fascinating, and there's sort of two things I wanted to throw back at Dan. One is that, can the inverse be true? Because I remember doing some field work with Joe McQuillan back in, it must have been 20 years ago, and we were measuring blood glucose and lactate of 24-hour mountain bike riders every time they came back into pit. And we would basically see that once they were starting to get to a point of glycogen depletion, there'd be a big rise in blood glucose. And so we assumed that was from a liver glycogen dump. So would that also be a potential there, is that when we see a spike in blood glucose, that there's potentially a liver glycogen dump, and the athlete actually needs more fuel at that point?
Yeah, well, that goes on to my point of what I talked about just a moment about, was kind of assessing like durability of an athlete. Is that, you know, you can have two athletes and their lactate level or their lactate threshold, right, could be at 260 watts. But one athlete could have great durability, and it'll be a very, very long time before they eventually would see that increase in blood glucose. Whereas a person who's not got that good a durability, that would likely happen much sooner. And it's the same, like, you know, you can talk with the power to heart rate ratios, because at the same time, you'll probably see heart rate pop up as well. So even like over the course of an Ironman run, for example, it's generally what you'll see is people will the heart rate will just be quite steady, and then suddenly, like, you know, 10k from the end, it'll just start going, and their pace hasn't changed. But it's just that there's so many things going on. There's economy, there's you know, just the tendon stiffness and all those things. But also there is a little bit that you'll have a dump of blood glucose, and even maximal heart rate can come down. Therefore, your threshold heart rate shifted down that little bit, and suddenly you've gone over your threshold, which means you're getting a bit of VO2 slow component rise, and all those sorts of things. They're all affecting. But I think the blood glucose and continuously monitoring it is another little tool in the toolbox to take a look at it.
So are you saying, Dan, that if I had a CGM and I went out for a run and I could real time see what my glucose was doing, if it was normal and stayed within normal the entire time, then that would suggest that, and I'm feeling fine, then that would suggest that fueling was like not an issue for me on that run, and it's only when it drops down or I get this massive rise that's when I need to start thinking about that.
It would be suggestive that your fat oxidation is you're pretty much fueling predominantly from fat at that point. Yeah, exactly.
Hey, so you guys will remember that paper that was published by Zevi and colleagues a few years back, and they were looking at basically the
2015.
That'll be it. And they were looking at the blood glucose responses to different foods, and they were really different across people.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm wondering...
The banana and the cookies.
Yeah. Have you seen... Yeah, or some people with, you know, massive blood glucose responses to white fish or something, and others not, you know. Have you noticed foods that you don't respond so well to?
Honestly, how long we got? Sit down. I've got this can go on for a while. So there's a few really interesting things. One is I've noticed things that can really help, like things I can do before that can stop any blood glucose rise. And there's also foods that definitely I don't really agree with. So like fruit generally is not that great for me. Even post exercise, it's not really that great. But if I found if I add a bit of peanut butter to it, it's generally not as bad, but it's still not always that great. But I've also noticed that typically after exercise, there's always this idea that, you know, you should eat straight after exercise because the GLUT4 transporters are open. You can bring the fuel straight into the muscle cell. What I generally find is that after I finish exercise, I will immediately get a little bit of a spike in blood glucose anyway, which is pretty normal as you kind of reset yourself. But I find that if I eat on then, that's worse. So it's best that I just wait a little bit longer, like wait about 30 minutes or so, and then I'll have some food rather than just rushing straight to the fridge and eating immediately. But also one thing that I found that surprised me was chicken. Chicken was not that great, particularly chicken breast. Chicken leg, a little bit better, but chicken wasn't that great. And also I, the paleo bread? No. Terrible.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But it's not that much carb in there, but really bad. So
well, it is tapioca flour, like it's like so it's not necessarily that low carb.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
You know, I think the difference might be 5 or 4 or 5 grams if we're looking at per slice compared to, say, your normal bread.
So yeah, that was, but then having like more of the hemp, the hemp bread that's more keto, absolutely fine.
Yeah.
And I will say that even though I'm biased, like SFuels, the SFuels, it does say the SF stands for spike free. If I have an SFuels bar, you wouldn't even know I've eaten it.
Wow.
It's completely flat.
Yeah.
And I know I might be biased, but it is outstanding. Like there's not often you can't even know I've eaten it. So
okay.
It's crazy.
So what about UCAN? What do you reckon?
Well, I haven't tested that with this yet.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting, just because to be honest, I love the UCAN bars. And so we had them on our trail run the other Sunday. We did the black trail around Redwoods, and I looked at the back of it because they're super easy to eat, and they do have the super starch in them, but they actually have dates as well. So the amount of super starch isn't actually as high. Like when you look at the carbohydrate content, it might only be half of that carbohydrate content, which I found sort of interesting.
Right, maybe I'll order some from you then, Cliff, and then we'll give it a try, and I'll report back.
That'd be interesting.
Hey, give it a crack.
Yeah.
Oh no, I just think it's an interesting area because there's again a lot of complexity within it, because where we're looking at something like that Zevi study where you're seeing what would be considered anomalous results and they're not consistent in any way across people. Obviously some of the food categories were very consistent and others were very inconsistent. That's, I think, more indicative than what a lot of people are doing with continuous glucose monitoring at the moment, which is just looking at whether they get a rise and that being arbitrarily bad. You know, I saw a Twitter post by somebody saying, you know, oats are bad for you because I'm wearing a continuous glucose monitor and my glucose spiked to whatever it was, 8 or 9 or something. So I went and read the blog post where they had outlined what they were doing. And within like an hour, they were back to about 4.5 millimoles.
Yeah.
So
exactly. Yeah.
Like all that shows us is that the person's eaten a bunch of carbs and disposed them.
Yeah, exactly. Because it doesn't matter too much if it's getting high. It matters how long it's staying high for. Because if it's going up and then coming back down, you're generally pretty sweet. And just on that same point is that, you know, there are if that is the case, if high blood glucose is a problem, then so is sauna. Sauna's not good for you. We can stop doing any high intensity interval training because that's going to get your blood glucose up. You know, there's even like coffee can have a bit of a marked increase in your blood glucose, and that's been proven to be nothing but good for you. So there's you know, there is a bit of a we need a way to look at the things that we do that will spike your blood glucose, but chronically improve your overall health and sensitivity, and then there are other things that would not. Yeah, go on, Mikki. You may go.
Thanks. So a couple of thoughts, right? So I think you're right that it doesn't necessarily matter how high it goes if within a couple of hours it's down to normal, but you do want to watch that rebound effect, right? And for some people, the rebound of having something like oats, like if it goes up to 8.5, 2 hours later it's normal, but maybe 2.5, 3 hours later they're down at 2.5. Like I think that's one thing to kind of think about. And also, of course, though, if that was the case, and I've noticed this in myself, is that if I add chia seeds, psyllium husk, protein powder, and peanut butter to my oats, I'm actually sweet. But if I just had, and it's the addition of fat for me to oats, which makes a difference, because if I just added protein powder to my oats, I am hungry again within like an hour. So, and I get that I'm quite reactive. Like, I'm like, oh, I really need something to eat. I guess that's something to be mindful of.
Interesting. Do you think there's a compounded insulin effect, Mikki?
I don't know. I think that's just the buffering of something. It's just slowing it down and it's staying in my system. I don't know. Maybe I'm not smart enough to know that stuff. But the other thing is with what you're right, Dan, like sauna, coffee, these all have really these are really beneficial from a health perspective because they work on multiple pathways, right? And it's not just that blood glucose response. And I think that's that real myopic approach that people can take to nutrition. Like carbs are bad because they raise your glucose without thinking. Yeah.
The effect of sauna on my blood glucose.
I'm actually in a sauna right now.
Yeah. No, well, we're actually funnily enough, we're having one. We're gonna get one built here.
Stop it,
because it's gonna be. I'm just well into it. So anyway, but we digress. And a proper Swedish one, none of this infrared crap. So anyway,
good on you.
But yeah, it's honestly, my blood glucose goes so high, like I'm doing a high intensity interval almost. It's absolutely nuts, and that's got to be of benefit. But just to finish up on the subject, two other things that I noticed really will stabilize my blood glucose. One is like cold water immersion, a cold shower. So the other day I went in the sea and then I came home, had a cold shower, then I had my dinner. It was nothing almost.
Wow.
Crazy.
Yeah.
And apple cider vinegar.
Yes, Cliff and I have often been in presentations where one or the other of us have said, have apple cider vinegar before a meal to help lower blood glucose response.
Yeah, I think you were the first person who ever told me that, Mikki. Yeah,
Probably.
So,
I am a brainiac.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there we go. But yeah, I continue to experiment with it, and I'm doing some work with Super Sapiens, hopefully in the future, and we're gonna, just making, the apps they're already a great company doing great things, and looking to, get a bit more out of it specifically for athletes who can use it to race and train. I think the efficacy of it is through the roof.
I have a Libra on order, I think, actually from MetaRay.
Yeah.
So that just means I have to download that Super Sapiens app, doesn't it?
Yeah. I don't think you can get it in New Zealand yet, but don't worry. I think you'll have some contacts who could get you maybe on the test flight.
Oh, fantastic. So I've got a couple of questions. We've talked about what coffee does to your blood sugar. Dan, the chicken thing, there wasn't any kind of dressing on that chicken. It was just the insulinogenic. What is that? What's going to impact on your blood sugar from something like the chicken?
Yeah, it's a good question because I know I was listening to a podcast and this person was saying that he found like green beans made him really like shoot up in. So there may be just some foods that just aren't that great. And maybe it's the fact that it's high protein and zero fat pretty much. That's the, so it's changing that glycemic load, and maybe that could be it.
Are you allergic? Like any kind of immune response or something?
No.
Cliff, would that make a difference to your sugar response?
It could do. I think it's just so hypothetical at the moment because it's so very difficult to tease out subclinical intolerance and allergy. And, I think that's what's really fascinating about that research on differential responses to foods, because it doesn't make intuitive sense. And it, like, for example, it may not be, if someone's having a really high blood glucose response to, say, white fish, but not to chicken breast, or the other way around, what's going on there? Because especially if they're, amino acid equivalent, there's not that much difference in terms of the macronutrient profile of them. So I think there's a lot that we don't understand there. The interesting functional outcome of that ZB study, to go back to that, was that they did then follow it up, obviously, with the second part of the study, which was to give people foods that were the best for them in terms of blood glucose response, and it gave very favourable outcomes. So, yeah, I guess the answer is we don't know, but it begs for further research. So I think Dan can do some more research in that space.
Yeah, well, I'll try. You know what? I haven't eaten that much. I've only noticed it like a couple of times, but so maybe I'll just chow down and I'll do lots of different chicken experiments. Don't tell the vegans; they won't like me for that.
But they don't like you anyway, chicken. Mate. Don't worry.
Yeah, that's a good valid point. But one thing that I will also say on that is I also noticed that the responses to the same food at different times of the day and different circumstances is it's just massive. So and that's one of with the study that you're referring to, the banana versus cookies. They have to be so tightly regulated in the timing of what you're giving them, what they've just done before, what they ate the night before, how there's so many different factors that are going to affect that, right? So which is why like intermittent fasting works, is because when you haven't eaten for a while, you are way more receptive to taking on food. You have less of an insulin response, therefore your blood glucose does not rise as high. So there's so many little factors to really get a good understanding of what's going on. You have to tightly control those things.
Red wine, Dan? Any idea?
No, I don't think I have had some red wine. It doesn't do much. No.
Well,
One thing that gets me is my kids. They have like these little, they call them puffs. They're like got a little teddy bear on the front, but they're like they've got pea kind of pea flour in there. Yeah. Man, they taste so good, but they also have a remarked effect. I can't help it when they that's one thing, but as you would expect. But do you know what? I'm willing to take the hit because they are so good.
You know what? Just do a 15-minute walk afterwards. Maybe that'll change.
Yeah, is it? For sure. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to having a play around with it. The one thing I'm a little bit concerned about is what my blood sugar response will be to fruit. As you've said, Dan, I've been into the fruit of late. Craft beer, like I'm a little bit scared of that. Because knowledge is power, and once you know, you can't unknow.
But timing is everything. You know, if you find something that's bad at a certain point, you can
or ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, ignorance is bliss. You can. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. You can just time it. Straight in the middle of a bike ride, or straight after, not too long after a bike ride, and you'll be your. A run. You don't bike ride.
No.
So so yeah, you'll be absolutely fine. You'll be away.
Yeah, awesome. So just to finish up on this conversation, anything new, anything exciting, anything we need to know about? Obviously, Dan, you've got your Enduro IQ. Your squad has started up. I think that you should tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So Enduro IQ. It's got two parts to it. The first part is online courses specifically for long distance triathlon. So we've got one on low carb nutrition that Mikki is a star in, and then we got one on training. We got one on the heat. Exercising in the heat, and now we're just building one on the middle of building the fourth course, which is on athlete monitoring, which is a bit of a beast, but it's good fun to put that together. And then the other side, we have our coaches, one-on-one coaching for long distance triathlon specifically, but then we have our Enduro IQ training squad, which is it's more of a group where we put up rolling plans, and it's just a platform where you can do training. You can scale. It's got thousands of different, hundreds of different training plans, hundreds of different workouts that are all scalable. So you can move things around in your week, make things fit you, and all the sessions are scalable. So if you've only got 30 minutes, you can make it 30 minutes. If you only got an hour, you can make it an hour. And that's on enduroriq.com.
That's awesome, Dan. And Cliff, you've got a few new things coming up at Holistic Performance Institute. Do you want to give us a wee rundown on that?
Yeah, well, I think at the moment, Mikki, we're all about you. The latest release we have is your nutrition for women's health module or course, and that's going great guns. We're getting lots of really good feedback on that and lots of sign-ups, so that's really our focus for the next little while. Outside of that, we obviously have our marquee courses, HPN1, which has 2 tracks, one of which people can become a fully qualified nutrition and health coach. The other one, they can become an accredited sports nutritionist with the Sports Nutrition Association. And those both lead on to HPN2, which allows people to be registered clinical nutritionists here in New Zealand.
That's awesome. And guys, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your Thursday afternoon, it's like pre-dinner drinks schedule to come on, had a convo. It's kind of like I was just sitting down having a conversation with you guys the way we would, but just happened to record it, which then means it's just beneficial for everyone else who always wished that they could have like a wee beer fly on the wall of these types of conversations.
I wish next time I'm bringing my own beer though. Because Cliff didn't
show.
No,
he didn't.
No, he didn't even. So I'll have to bring my own.
Obviously, it was going to be in person, but.
All right, team. Have a great night.
Cool. Thank you.
So, team, hope you enjoyed that conversation. I've got to say, I always learn so much from those guys, and it's really just so cool that I get to have these conversations, soak up all of that information and learning, but then also put it out there to you guys so you also get the benefit of connecting with brains like Dan and Cliff. So you can catch Cliff at cliffharvey.com or over on Instagram at cliffydog, or Dan at enduroriq.com, or over on Instagram, he's pretty active really, at the Plews. Next week on the show, I am stoked to chat to Mel Law, who is the founder of Wild Things, all about building community through running. And it's a fun conversation, whether or not you're a runner or otherwise. Mel is such a great guy. So until then, team, you can find me over on Twitter and Instagram at Mikki Williden, where I share research things which I've come across, what's literally what I do almost every day, have heaps of conversations over there. or over on Facebook at Williden Nutrition, or jump over to my website, MikkiWilliden.com, sign up to one of the free courses there, and then you'll get access to my weekly emails where, again, I just share with you the things that I'm reading and thinking about on a weekly basis. You can also sign up to one of my meal plans, be it a longevity approach to diet, just a good real food approach to nutrition, or some fat loss through my woman and male specific fat loss plans, and they're 8 weeks. Monday's Matter is over halfway through now, and we're getting great traction, so don't worry if you missed out on that. We are going to launch another one in spring, so really looking forward to just continuing this journey with people that are on that course. And of course, if you're looking for individualized approach to diet, book a consultation with me over on my website, MikkiWilliden.com. All right, team, until next week, have a fab week. See you later.